My name is Sharon Walker. I'm 66 years old, and I spent 31 years as a certified public accountant, the last 19 of them running my own small tax and bookkeeping practice out of a converted storefront on Chestnut Street in Millbrook, Ohio. That's the credibility. Here's the part that still doesn't sit right in my chest. My own son handed me a nursing home admission contract at my kitchen table over scrambled eggs on an ordinary Tuesday morning, and I handed him back the keys to the house he grew up in. I want to tell you exactly what my son, Brandon, said to me that morning because I've replayed it every single day since. He slid a manila folder across the table between the toast and the orange juice and said, "Mom, we already toured Cedar Grove last week. Melissa thinks it's best if we get you settled before the fall." Cedar Grove, a nursing home, for a woman who still drove herself to the grocery store, still did her own taxes, and still managed 22 client accounts from her home office every single week. But here's what Brandon didn't know yet. Sitting across from me in the kitchen, I had paid off myself 14 years earlier. 6 months before that breakfast, I had already quietly transferred the deed of that house into a living trust with my attorney, and 3 days after that breakfast, Brandon and his wife Melissa would be standing on my front porch at 8 p.m., locked out, staring at a house that legally had never actually belonged to them at all. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where this really started. If you're watching this tonight and something about it already feels a little too familiar, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is right now for you. I read every single comment. I grew up in a working-class family in Dayton, Ohio, the middle child between two brothers, Gary and Michael. My father worked the assembly line at the Frigidaire plant for 34 years, coming home every evening smelling of machine oil and cigarettes, and my mother made it very clear, in the particular way mothers of that generation had, that my brother's futures mattered more than mine did. Gary went to Ohio University on money my parents scraped together by taking out a second mortgage on our small house on Whitmore Street. Michael got a used car for his 16th birthday, paid for in cash my father had saved for 2 years. I was told at 17, standing in our kitchen while my mother ironed my father's work shirts, that college wasn't really necessary for a girl who was just going to get married anyway. I got a job as a bank teller instead at the First National Bank branch on Route 9, took night classes at the community college for 6 years after my shifts ended, and earned my accounting degree at 26, working full days and studying until 1 a.m. most nights at my kitchen table with a slide rule and a stack of borrowed textbooks. My mother never once came to a single one of my exams. She drove 3 hours to Gary's college graduation in 1979 and cried through the entire ceremony, telling everyone at the reception afterward how proud she was of her son, the engineer. I married a machinist named Richard Walker in the fall of 1983, in a small ceremony at St. Andrews with maybe 40 guests and a reception in the church basement. Richard was quiet, steady, and never once made me feel like my ambitions were something to apologize for. We had one son together, Brandon, born in the spring of 1986. In a hospital room I still remember down to the color of the walls. Richard passed away from lung cancer in the winter of 2009 on a Sunday afternoon at 3:15 p.m. in a hospital bed we'd set up in our own living room, where I'd insisted on caring for him myself for the last 4 months of his life instead of moving him to a facility, changing his medications on schedule, reading to him in the evenings when the pain medication made it hard for him to focus on the television. He was 51 years old. I was 50 with a 19-year-old business just getting its footing, a mortgage still owed at $61,000, and a grief so heavy I genuinely didn't know how I'd get out of bed most mornings that spring, let alone open the office and greet clients like everything was fine. I didn't fold, though. I couldn't afford to. That first spring after Richard died, I remember specific nights sitting at my kitchen table until 1 a.m. with a stack of client files and a cold cup of coffee, teaching myself QuickBooks updates I'd never needed while Richard was alive to help with the yard work and the bills. I remember March of 2010, standing in my empty driveway after dropping Brandon off at a friend's house, realizing I had gone 11 days without a single adult conversation that wasn't about someone else's tax return. I threw myself into the accounting practice because it was the only thing that made sense to me anymore, Took on 12 new clients that first year alone through sheer word of mouth around Chestnut Street, and slowly built something that felt like solid ground under my feet again. By 2015, Walker Tax and Bookkeeping was generating $310,000 a year in revenue, with a client roster that included half the small business owners on Chestnut Street, the hardware store, 2 restaurants, a veterinary clinic, and eventually the same bank where I'd once worked as a teller decades earlier, now a client instead of an employer. I paid off the mortgage on my house in the spring of 2011, standing in my own driveway with the paid-in full letter in my hand, thinking about my mother telling me college wasn't really necessary for a girl. I drove the same reliable Toyota Camry for 11 straight years through all of that growth, refusing to spend on myself until the practice itself was standing on solid ground. I put Brandon through Ohio State on a combination of my savings and a modest scholarship, paying $38,000 out of pocket across 4 years without a single complaint, driving up to Columbus for every parent's weekend I could manage, even during the brutal weeks of tax season, because I had grown up watching my own mother reserve her attention for my brothers, and I swore I would never make my son feel that same absence. Brandon met Melissa Torres during his senior year of college. She was polished, career-driven, and from our very first dinner together at Antonelli's on 5th Street, subtly dismissive of what I did for a living. She asked what kind of accounting I specialized in, and when I told her small business bookkeeping and individual tax prep, she said, "Oh, so more like a bookkeeper than a real accountant," with a small smile that made it clear exactly what she thought that distinction meant. I let it go that night, the way you let a lot of things go when you want your son to be happy. They married in 2013. I paid for a third of the wedding, $14,000, without being asked twice, because I still believed, foolishly, that generosity bought you a permanent place in a family. It doesn't. It only ever resets the price of admission for the next request. The real trouble started 2 years ago, in the spring, when Brandon and Melissa asked me to co-sign a $340,000 business loan so Melissa could open a second location of her boutique fitness studio in the Ashford Hills shopping plaza. They came to my kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon, April 20th at 1 p.m., and laid out a business plan I recognized immediately as thin. No real contingency for a slow first year, optimistic membership projections that didn't match the demographics of that plaza, and a debt-to-income ratio that would have put my own retirement accounts at serious risk if the studio failed. As a CPA of 31 years, I knew better than to sign my name to numbers that didn't work. I said no. I offered instead to gift them $20,000 toward a smaller, lower-risk expansion, and Melissa stood up from my table so fast her chair nearly tipped over, saying, "Unbelievable. So this is what you actually think of us." Brandon said nothing. He just looked down at his coffee, the way he always looked down at his coffee whenever a decision required him to pick a side. We barely spoke for 4 months after that Sunday, just the occasional one-line text about nothing in particular. Then this past spring, Brandon called and asked to come by for breakfast, said he wanted to reconnect, and I let hope get the better of me, the way it always does with your own child, no matter how many times you've been disappointed before. I spent that Monday evening planning the menu like it actually mattered, scrambled eggs the way he liked them, wheat toast, the good orange juice instead of the store brand. He and Melissa showed up together on a Tuesday morning at 8 a.m. sharp, both dressed like they had somewhere important to be afterward. I made scrambled eggs and toast, the same breakfast I'd made him every school morning growing up, the smell of butter in the pan filling the kitchen the way it always had. And somewhere between the toast and the orange juice, Brandon reached into his bag and slid a manila folder across the table, a full admission contract for Cedar Grove Senior Living, $5,800 a month, already partially filled out with my full legal name and date of birth typed neatly into the intake fields, and told me they'd already toured the facility without me the week before, on a Thursday afternoon while I was at my own office filing a client's quarterly return. I sat there for a long moment, looking at that folder, at my own son's handwriting on the emergency contact line where he'd already written Melissa's name and cell number instead of mine as the primary point of contact. My coffee went cold in my hands. I asked him, calmly, why exactly they thought I needed a nursing home when I still drove myself to church every Sunday, still filed 22 clients' tax returns every quarter without a single late submission in 19 years, and still lived independently in a house I had paid off with my own two hands. Melissa answered before he could, setting her fork down with a small, deliberate click against the plate. She said, "Sharon, it's just safer this way." And honestly, the house would sell for enough to cover most of the first 2 years. There it was, laid out plainly across my own breakfast table. Not concerned for my safety. Real estate math, dressed up as love. If any part of this is landing close to home for you, go ahead and drop a comment. I read every single one. I didn't argue with them at that table. I want to be very clear about that because so many people expect an older woman to break down crying in a moment like that, and I didn't give either of them the satisfaction. I closed the folder, slid it back across the table, and said, "I appreciate you thinking of me. I'll take it under advisement." Then I finished my coffee, calm as anything, while my son wouldn't meet my eyes and his wife checked her phone like the conversation was already over for her. The next morning, I called my attorney, a woman named Patricia Doyle who had handled my will and my late husband's estate years earlier, her office just 2 blocks from my own on Chestnut Street. I told her everything. The loan refusal, the 4 months of silence, the nursing home folder over breakfast, Melissa's comment about the house selling, the emergency contact line with someone else's name on it. Patricia was quiet for a moment on the other end of the line, then said, "Sharon, you've spent 31 years reading other people's balance sheets. It's time to read your own family's." That week, on her advice, I moved my house, my retirement accounts, and my business into a living trust with very specific, very deliberate language about who would inherit what and under what conditions and who would have any say whatsoever in decisions about my care and my residence going forward. For the weeks that followed, I said nothing to Brandon about any of it. I kept living my normal life, closing out tax season for my clients, having lunch with my sister Diane on Fridays at the same diner we'd gone to since we were in our 20s, keeping a small folder of my own in my desk drawer with copies of every text, every email, every conversation I could document, not out of spite, but because 31 years in accounting teaches you that paper trails are a kind of protection, and protection is not the same thing as bitterness. I noted the exact date Melissa mentioned the house sale. I noted the exact date Brandon filled out that emergency contact line with someone else's name. I noted the folder's letterhead, the facility's monthly rate, everything, filed neatly the way I'd filed client documents for 3 decades. 3 days after that breakfast, Brandon and Melissa showed up at my house again, unannounced, at 8 p.m. on a Friday evening, carrying 2 suitcases between them and a look on both their faces I hadn't seen before. Something closer to panic than entitlement. Melissa's studio had defaulted on a smaller equipment loan she'd taken out without my co-signature, the one she assured everyone she didn't need Sharon's help with anyway back in April, and their apartment lease had fallen through in the fallout after the landlord ran a credit check that turned up the default. Brandon stood on my porch under the same light fixture I'd replaced myself 2 summers earlier and said, "Mom, we just need somewhere to stay for a few weeks while we figure things out." I looked at him for a long moment, thought about that manila folder sitting in my desk drawer, thought about the house would sell for enough, and I said evenly, "I'm sorry, Brandon, but this house isn't available for that right now." Melissa's face went pale under the porch light. She said, "What do you mean it's not available? It's your house." I told her calmly that it was, in fact, held in a trust now, structured months ago on legal advice, and that trusts have very specific rules about who can and cannot reside there, rules I had no intention of bending that night. They didn't come inside. I watched from behind my living room curtain as they sat in their car in my driveway for almost 40 minutes, engine running, before finally backing out and driving away, presumably to Melissa's parents' place across town, the same parents who had once called my accounting practice more like a bookkeeper than a real accountant at a Thanksgiving dinner years earlier. For the 2 months after that, there was mostly silence again, though a different kind than before. Less cold, more uncertain, the silence of 2 people recalculating rather than 2 people simply avoiding each other. I heard through my sister Diane, who still ran into Melissa's mother at the grocery store occasionally, that the 2 of them had moved into a small rental across town, month to month, while they sorted out the loan default. I didn't reach out. I let the silence sit exactly where it was. Then, in late June, Brandon called and asked if we could talk. Just the two of us, no Melissa. We met at a diner on Route 9, the same one I used to work at as a bank teller decades earlier before it changed hands twice and became a diner. The same cracked vinyl booths, though the coffee was better now than it had been in 1978. He looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with lack of sleep, the kind of tired that comes from carrying a decision you know was wrong. He ordered black coffee, no food, and turned the cup in slow circles for a while before he finally spoke. He said, "Mom, I've been thinking a lot about that breakfast. I let Melissa make that decision, and I didn't even ask you what you wanted. I just went along with it because it was easier than arguing with her." I told him, honestly, that easier isn't the same as right, and that a son doesn't get to hand his mother a nursing home contract like an eviction notice and call it love, no matter how it gets dressed up in words like safer and settled. He didn't argue with me. He sat there across that diner table, turning his coffee cup slowly, staring at the ring of condensation it left on the formica, and for the first time in a long while, I saw something honest on his face, not defensiveness, not an excuse ready to go, just real regret settling into the lines around his eyes. He said, "I don't know how to undo that morning." I told him he didn't have to undo it. He just had to stop letting someone else make decisions about my life without me in the room, starting today, starting with this conversation. He's been coming by on his own, without Melissa, most Sunday afternoons since then, sometimes just to fix something around the house. He replaced a leaking faucet in my upstairs bathroom 2 weeks ago, the same faucet Richard had meant to fix years before he got sick, and sometimes just to sit on the porch and talk about nothing in particular, the way we used to when he was in high school. Melissa has not reached out once in all that time, and honestly, that silence tells me everything I need to know about what that breakfast really was and who it was actually for. My brother Gary, meanwhile, called me for the first time in 2 years last month, right around the time word got out through the family grapevine about the trust, not out of brotherly love, I suspect, but out of a sudden curiosity about numbers that were never his business to begin with. I let that call go straight to voicemail, and I haven't felt the slightest urge to call him back. I still see my clients every week. I still file returns without a single late submission. I still drive myself to church every Sunday morning in the same Toyota Camry, windows down when the weather allows it, radio tuned to the same country station I've listened to since Richard was alive. Cedar Grove Senior Living has never heard from me, and it never will, not on anyone else's timeline but my own, whenever that day eventually comes, decided by me and no one else. Here's what I want you to take away from tonight, in my own words, because 31 years of reading other people's finances taught me to say things plainly. When someone hands you a contract instead of a conversation, that tells you everything about what they actually see when they look at you. It tells you what column they've already put you in, long before you've had any say in the matter. You are allowed to hand the keys back. You are allowed to be 66 years old, sharp, independent, and completely unwilling to be filed away like a closed account before your time, regardless of how convenient your absence might be for someone else's spreadsheet. I think about that breakfast often, not with anger anymore, but with the kind of clarity I probably needed my whole life. My mother spent decades teaching me, without ever meaning to, that a woman's needs come second to everyone else's convenience. It took a manila folder over scrambled eggs at 66 years old for me to finally, fully unlearn that lesson for good. If this story meant something to you tonight, hit subscribe, drop a comment telling me which part hit hardest, and share this with someone who needs to hear it. I'll see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves out there.